So, I was in an elevator with a friend last weekend, leaving another friend's dorm after a D&D session. We were just kind of talking about what to do with our next level up, and all of a sudden a random guy in the elevator standing next to us just turned over and said, "Oh, are you playing a two-handed paladin in 5e? The Great Weapon Master feat is really cool, you should totally take it when you get to level 4. And then it hit me, this game is huge now. Just like 5 or 6 years ago, I could have mentioned D&D to a casual friend with some kind of nerdy hobbies, like comics or Nintendo games, and they probably would have either laughed or had no idea what I was talking about. But according to statistics, 2017 was the best-selling year in D&D's history. And it's established enough in the public lexicon that I can say something about armor class or magic missiles or owlbears in front of a random group on campus, or even on the street, and a large portion will at least know what I'm talking about. Which is pretty awesome. At the very least, just about everyone my age seems to have some idea of what D&D is. Some of you watching might be thinking, yeah, I know what it is, it's just not for me, and if I could, I would probably try to convince you to try it anyway, but that's a topic for another day. So anyway, onto the subject of the video. How did D&D go from relative obscurity to near the forefront of pop culture in just a few years? Now, I've heard some people point to the recent 80s craze generally, and Stranger Things in particular. While Stranger Things might have been the spark that lit the fire, the fuel had been laid for it already. And I think it had to do with a lot more than just retro nostalgia. Not only because D&D is even more popular now than it was in the 80s, but also because the modern player base largely wasn't even alive in that decade, or at least wasn't playing back then. Also, tabletop RPGs are really no older than video games, and like video games, they've significantly changed with the times, though not to quite the same degree. So this D&D revival isn't really a return to the good old days before computers came along, but rather has happened largely because of computers' help. Which brings me directly into my first point. Anyone who's scheduled games does know that getting a group of 4 to 8 people together for a few hours once a week can be kind of hard, so online play does make the logistics more flexible. And maybe this is because I was pretty young at the time, but it seemed like even in the era of 4th edition, when I started playing, it was really difficult to play with anyone other than local friends at a real table. Sure, there were play-by-post games, but those can be really slow, and if you wanted to play remotely in real time, the technology was pretty faulty from what I can remember. Nowadays, just playing on Discord can be almost as good as a face-to-face session, and there are plenty of massive communities where a complete newbie can find a new group. There also seems to be a thriving discussion/guide/commentary community on the internet. During the time of 4th edition, I watched YouTube about as much as I do now, and scarcely remember a single channel that as much as mentioned a tabletop RPG. Now there are plenty of great creators whose channels are primarily dedicated to the game of D&D, not to mention shows like Critical Role, who I'd guess are really fostering interest in both players and DMs. Also, I think the decision to put most of the 5th edition rules into public domain really helped the community, since casual players can now play even in an online game without needing to commit to buying the book yet. And speaking of that new edition, I don't want to ramble on for too long about the mess that was 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Puffin Forest has a great video on it that's pretty in-depth and also really funny, so go check it out if you want the details. But in short, 4th edition was confusing, overcomplicated, and unimmersive, and unlike 3.5 and old school AD&D, nobody really plays it anymore from what I can tell. On the other hand, 5th edition is the most intuitive and approachable version of the game probably ever. I personally can't be totally confident about this statement because I haven't played anything before 3rd edition. But from what I've heard, the early editions did have some really clunky mechanics. But 5th edition is great. Not perfect, but really easy for new players to digest. With small numbers, unique but balanced classes, mechanics that encourage role-playing and backstory integration, and an overall classic fantasy feel with characters that don't feel overpowered at low levels. Unlike in 4th edition, no mechanic seems to have been directly inspired by a video game, and it's because of this that no 5e session that I can remember has really felt like a video game. Not that there's anything wrong with video games, it's just that D&D should be a different experience. In fact, a large portion of fantasy movies and video games of the last 30 years were directly or indirectly inspired by D&D, so it makes sense that they've renewed interest in D&D down the line. I feel like most people, myself included, got into the concept of role-playing games primarily through the context of video games or movies, or possibly literature. In my case, my thoughts after the first session were basically, wow, a version of Zelda where I can draw my own levels or do crazy unorthodox things to solve problems? This is awesome. Then, soon enough, I came to appreciate things like getting into character and planning campaigns that are central to the D&D game. It kind of came naturally, and I think it will for most people, to be honest. By now, pretty much everyone is familiar with concepts like hit points and goblins and necromancers because the fantasy genre is huge. Look at Game of Thrones, a show with both dungeons and dragons. It was probably the biggest show of the last decade. You can't possibly be called a nerd for watching it. So the addition of role-playing and dice rolls isn't going to be a big jump for most people. So yeah, that's why I think D&D has gotten so big in the past few years. Honestly, I think it's gotten as big as it should be. The only thing I'm kind of concerned about is the fact that other role-playing systems are largely still floundering, but that's a topic for another video. So thanks for watching, and be sure to like and/or subscribe if you enjoyed. See you later!